So, you want to play Ra with a VEL macro? Well then, being a mid laner is for you. So continuing my comprehensive role guide videos, we're going to be covering the mid lane in today's video. If you guys enjoyed the guide and learned some stuff from it, then be sure to share the video around with anyone else you think could learn from it, but let's get right into the guide. As always, I'll be splitting the guide up into more manageable chunks covering specific areas of the role to give the guide some structure and make it a bit easier to follow. Here's a list of what I'm going to be covering throughout the video in chronological order. First up, the basics of the role. This will cover the very basics of what mid lane is about. If you already know Conquest, you can probably skip this section. Moving on to your role in the team. Similar to the first section, this one can also be skipped if you already know the very basics of Conquest and like team dynamics in the mode. It basically just tells you what your role is in the team. Next up, we'll be looking at what type of gods and items you should be looking at as a mid laner. After that, early game and laning strategies. This section will cover the first 10 minutes or so of the game and some advanced strategies to get ahead and win the laning phase as a mid laner. Next up, objectives, rotations and skirmishes. Kind of self-explanatory, this section will cover objective play, how and when to rotate effectively from the lane, and those mid-game skirmish type fights that are somewhere between a 1v1 and a full-blown team fight. And finally we'll close it out with late game team fighting and team play. This section will cover late game 5v5 team fights and what you should be doing to keep safe while also dishing out some major damage for your team in these fights. Okay, without further ado, let's kick off the guide with the basics of mid lane. In Conquest, the mid laner resides, rather obviously, in the mid lane in the centre of the map. They are often a mage and will be the main AoE burst damage dealer in the team. If you like mages and blowing people up, this is probably your role. You'll be clearing minions in the mid lane and rotating to other lanes and objectives throughout the game, as you are key to any team fight that might happen during the course of the game. Okay, moving on to your role in the team when you play mid lane. As I mentioned before, your role as a mid laner is usually a burst damage role that provides huge AoE ability damage in team fights. This isn't always 100% the case, but most of the time that's your role in the team. Mages of course are designed to fit this role well due to their large AoE abilities and incredibly strong late game burst damage. But you're also very squishy as a trade-off and quite easy to kill, so you'll need to play smart and have good assistance from characters like your support to actually survive in team fights and part of your damage. Diving in as a mid laner is usually not the best idea. Okay, now we've covered the basics, let's move on to what gods and item builds you should be looking at for being a mid laner. For starters, I'm going to be approaching this section assuming you're playing a typical burst mage. Gods like Freya, Kronos, Jonqui, or even the Morrigan might differ in their build choices slightly, as will any hunters you decide to play in mid lane. I'll provide a good ability based hunter build for gods like Neith at the end of the section, but for now we're going to focus on the more popular gods for mid, the mages. So let's kick it off with starting builds. There are a bunch of different starts for your 1500 gold that you can launch into a wide variety of diverse build paths for mages. I'll try and cover a few of the more popular ones, but bear in mind that there are a load of different possible starts you can try as a mid laner. So first up, probably the most popular start will be Mage's Blessing, a tier 1 item, and potions. So you of course spend 700 gold on Mage's Blessing, giving you extra clear and poke with the ability damage and extra mana sustain, as well as the cooldown reduction once it evolves. You're then left with 800 gold to spend on a tier 1 item and some potions. If you aim to stack Book of Thoth, starting with Spellbook will allow you to get it online quickly. Same thing with Warlock Staff, get Uncommon Staff and try and get it up and running as early as you can. You could also try getting Tiny Trinket if you want to rush Bancross Talon or Typhon's Fang for some early lifesteal and damage. This works pretty well on gods like Sol and Anubis that make good use of the lifesteal. You could also just go the safe route with tier 1 shoes and get your boots done as fast as possible, and after your tier 1 item you would then fill up on potions with any remaining gold for sustain in the early game. Generally I like more health than mana pots, but if you have Tiny Trinket that could help with the HP sustain a bit early on. Still, health is usually better than mana for laning phases, so especially given the innate mana sustain on Mage's Blessing, but potions layout is really up to you and your playstyle. Another decent start will be getting tier 2 of your stacking item and then potions. For example, Book of Souls for Book of Thoth or Sorcerer's Staff for Warlock Staff. This start is more high risk, high reward strategy as you get like limited sustain and early damage by foregoing the Mage's Blessing and less potions. But the start will allow you to get onto your stacking super early in the game, sometimes even on your first back if you're doing well. You of course then fill up on potions as per the first start that I mentioned. It's also worth mentioning that tier 2 Bancross Talon is sometimes used, mainly on Anubis, like to rush it as a first item to control the early game as it gives them a huge power spike. I don't like this start very much though as it's so slow in the early game. Even on Anubis I feel there's better ways to start that don't compromise your level 1 through 5 quite as much. On Hunter mids you probably want Mage's Blessing also, but you could try Hunter's Blessing as well. You'll probably then start with Transcendence as an ability-based hunter and move into a traditional ability-based build. Okay, moving on from starting builds, let's talk about your boots of choice. On almost every damage-based mage, I like penetration boots right now over every other choice. The early game power and penetration is just too insane to pass up and it's usually better than what the other boots offer. Cooldown boots can be useful on certain gods that either need penetration less early on or make really good use of the early CDR, for example Hell. Tank boots and Talaria boots sacrifice too much damage to be viable on mages in my opinion. I'd stick to penetration boots or cooldown boots. Ability based hunters in the mid lane will 100% want warrior tabby every time. The 40 power is too good to pass up early on. Alright, in terms of items after boots, I can't cover builds for every single god that you can play in mid, so I'll just mention a few good items that I build on a lot of burst mages, and then conclude this section with a few 4-build examples for various mages and one for hunters. As mentioned before, Warlock Staff is a great item right now for survivability and damage. Until it gets nerfed, I'd recommend this on pretty much every mage. Book of Thoth's also not bad, but it's often outclassed by Warlocks in most situations. Chronos Pendant is great for a ton of early CDR on gods that make good use of it. You can even build it later on if you want. In terms of penetration, Spear of the Mages is good on gods that can stack it up well with the tick damage. Spear of Desolation is great always for flat pen, and Obsidian Shard is still good against tanks. There's also Divine Ruin as the option against healers if they have one. Soul Gem is seeing a lot of play right now, but after its nerfs it'll probably be a bit less popular, but still good. On the topic of lifesteal, Bancroft is great on certain gods, and combined with Typhon's Fang it can provide a lot of power and sustain, but it does take up 2 slots in your build to do that. Soul Reaver is great for burst damage, and the 130 power is pretty insane on Soul Reaver as well. Ethereal Staff is also kind of decent, but similar to the Warlock Staff versus Book of Thoth debate, I think Ethereal Staff is just outclassed by Soul Reaver right now. Any combination of these items should do you fine as long as you have plenty of power and penetration in your build. Here's some full build examples for burst mages and ability based hunters in mid lane. For mages, Warlock Staff, Shoes of the Magi, Spear of Desolation, Chronos Pendant, Soul Reaver, Obsidian Shard. For ability based hunters, Transcendence, Warrior Tabby, The Crusher, Executioner, Assy, Bloodforge. Relics for mid laners are a pretty simple affair. On most mages and hunters you want beads and Aegis to keep you safe from CC and damage in teamfights. You lose too much defensive capabilities by going anything other than these 2 relics on a squishy mid laner in my opinion. Quick end note for this section, as this video ages the builds will likely get more and more outdated as items change. In the case that you're watching this far in the future and you just want to check out good builds for other roles, I'd highly recommend SmiteProBuilds.com. I'm not like affiliated with the site or anything like that, it's just a really useful site for plebs to quickly get up to date on what's on top of the meta without needing to watch all the SPL games for hours on end. So go check it out if you ever need build help. Okay, let's move on to early game and laning phase strategies. So at the very start of the game, there's 2 options for your start right now. One involves you helping your jungler at the speed buff, where you would simply fire your ability at the camp and then rush to lane quickly. The other option is simply starting in lane. The first one gets your jungler a faster start, whereas the second one gets you a faster start. It usually depends on your team comp and playstyles which one you go for. After the start, you'll be clearing the first wave as fast as you can. This is where your matchup comes in. If you're typically going to win the lane clear, you can likely pressure the enemy out and look to get one of the mid camps for yourself. You can either take one or both of these harpies depending on how much of a lead you got in the laning phase and how much damage you're taking from the camp. These mid camps are great to take between wave 1 and 2 as you get some extra XP and gold on top of your lead that you already had. It's also important to try and focus the archers if you can early on in the minion waves. They do over 2/3 of the wave's total damage and are much easier to kill than warriors, so killing them off early limits the damage your wave takes and allows you to get pressure as your minions push the enemy. Depending on what your jungler does, they may or may not be around mid lane around wave 2. If they are, you can look to secure the other mid harpies, oracles, red buff, even invade if you want to if you have pressure after wave 2 or 3. If your jungler hangs around in solo for a bit, which does happen sometimes, they'll likely turn up a bit later, maybe around wave 4 or 5 even. In which case, some stuff might change, but in general you're looking to optimise your farm and prioritise your wave first, and then if there's downtime, get some jungle farm like mid camps and red buff, etc. You may also want to roam a bit in the early game, and maybe even gank early with your jungler depending on your team comp. More late game gods will focus more on safe farm in the mid lane, but more early game picks will probably want to pressure and rotate when they hit their power spikes, maybe do some invading, things like that. You can also utilise wards to help in both these scenarios. If you're ahead, you can aggressive ward on enemy buffs and things, and in enemy choke points to try and catch people out, and if you're behind, you can defensive ward to counter ganks and stop enemy rotations, or even ward your own buffs to try and counter enemy invades. For example, if you spot the enemy jungler in right jungle on a ward, you can hug the left side of mid lane to be safer against the potential gank as you can slip away into your own left jungle if you need to. Okay, moving on to objective based play, rotations and skirmishes. As a mid laner, you're extremely important for objective based play. Since most of the time you're going to be playing a burst mage, you're going to be the designated objective securer for your team. This means you need to be there not only for pumping damage into the objective, but also to deal the killing blow and prevent any steal attempts from enemy players. This means you've got to have good positioning and situational awareness of any enemies looking to steal, predict their movements and try to avoid any CC being thrown at you so you're in position to secure like the Gold Fury Fire Giant or Pyromancer for your team. Having wards helps a ton with this as you can see if any enemies are flanking or looking to steal over the wall with their ultimate. You gotta have good timing as well of course and pay attention to the boss's health and how quickly it's depleting. I've seen way too many mids use their ultimate to secure a fire giant but leave it on 300 HP and it gets stolen by the enemy team. Don't be afraid to use your regular abilities on enemies as well though. If the enemies are numerous and try to stop your objective attempt, it's okay to drop it and just poke out or kill any enemy stepping too far in. Mages are great with this, as their huge AoE abilities can provide zone control and a lot of damage that can potentially turn a Gold Fury into a bait and land a few kills, in which case you also might get the Gold Fury after that as well. Just pay attention to your surroundings and what your team is looking to do and either fight or secure the objective based on that. Moving on to rotations. Mid lane is by nature a role that needs to be rotating and participating in fights a lot. Due to its central location on the map, it's often used as a hub for players to group up and fight around as it's close to all the major objectives on the map. How often and at what time you rotate depends on your pick and your team's picks. More early game pressure focused gods will want to rotate more as they hit their power spikes early on, to try and snowball the lanes into an early lead and win the game off that. Whereas more late game focused picks will want to play more conservatively and not compromise their farm too much for rotations, so they can reach their full potential in the late game and win off that. Dual lane is often a common rotation for a mid laner in the early game, as the ADC is often easy pickings for a mage, especially if it's a gank with the jungler as well, but don't underestimate the power of a mage on shutting down an enemy solo laner as well. Solo laners will often build solely physical defense in the early game if they're against a physical laner. So if this is the case, you do almost as much damage to them as you will be doing to a squishy target, so you can often shut them down really easily and maybe even force them into early magical defense, which might hurt them in lane just to deal with you. If the enemy solo is running the lane but only has physical defense online, seriously consider putting them in their place with your high burst damage on a mage. I've already talked about skirmishes a bit. These often happen earlier in the game before ADCs and solos join the fights properly and can be up to 3v3 or 4v4 in size, but might be smaller. They often happen in the jungle, fighting over neutral camps or invades. These fights are prime time to turn the game in your favour, as a 2 or 3 man wipe opens up the way for a Gold Fury or an early tier 1 tower if you come out on top. It's important to recognise if it's a fight you have a chance at winning or not though. Sometimes you just need to back off if you're low health or very far behind, even if it costs you a buff camp or some farm. It's better than dying. But if you're on the opposite end, force the issue and either take the jungle or straight up kill them. Then use that incremental lead to take towers and objectives as it grows out of control. And finally, let's talk a bit about late game team fighting and team play. As I've briefly touched on before, the mid laner is often squishy but provides a huge impact to fights due to the high endgame burst damage and large AoEs. In an ideal scenario, you'll be firing your abilities from way far away and hitting multiple people and winning the fight on your own, but that's not always how Smite works. There's obviously enemy gods like assassins and warriors that will likely be focusing you out. This means you've got to manage your cooldowns and pay attention to what's going on around you. Sometimes it's better to save some abilities to escape as opposed to just singling out one guy and just all-inning him and then dying. Same thing applies to your movement ability if you have one. It's sometimes okay to save it if you have support on hand from your teammates. They might be able to provide peel for you and then you still have the extra safety with your cooldown ready if you need it. An important thing to utilise in teamfights are jungle walls. Especially on gods like Thoth, Raijin or Discordia that can throw a lot of their damage from over walls. It can be really powerful as it keeps you very safe behind the jungle wall and still allows you to deal some major damage. Being behind a jungle wall protects you from certain abilities that can't go through walls and also makes enemies use leaps or teleports to chase you over the wall, at which point you can use some ability to retreat to safety after that. Jungle teamfights are really where mages shine currently in my opinion. Where like a hunter's main source of damage is its auto attacks and it's single target and can't go through walls, mage abilities often go over or through walls and can catch multiple people in tight jungle corridors near objectives and devastate a fight. So make sure you use the environment to your advantage when playing a mage. The big jungle teamfights are a huge reason why Thoth is so strong right now, as he can throw all 3 of his damaging abilities from miles away over walls and impact a fight from a position of complete safety. That's generally what mages are all about in teamfights, throwing their huge damage from a position of safety and staying alive to get more rotations of cooldowns out and impact the fight as much as possible. Anyway, that's going to wrap it up for this section and the guide. If you enjoyed and learned some stuff, be sure to leave a rating and recommend it to other people who could benefit from it. Also, leave a comment if you have any extra tips or any other videos you want to see from me in the future. But anyway, that's about it. See you guys in the next video. Peace out, nerds.